Okay, it looks like the numbers are starting to slow down, but we still have some people trickling in. We are going to start off though. So hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second part of our nutrition series of this webinar series, Hitting the Bullseye with Targeted Feeding, Feeding for Performance. My name is Sydney Fortier. I'm a Research and Innovation Coordinator with the BCRC, and I will be your moderator this evening. We are very happy and excited to be able to put these webinars on to you guys for free, thanks to the Knowledge Dissemination and Technology Transfer Project funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and Canada's Beef Science Cluster. So if you guys have any questions whatsoever that come up throughout the course of the webinar, we want you to ask them, and we want you to do it through our Q&A function at the top of your Zoom screen. If you click on there, you'll be able to ask your questions. If you put them in the chat, they just get lost, and it just gets a little tough to pull those during the live Q&A session. So yeah, feel free to ask any and all questions right in there. Just a reminder also, this webinar is being recorded, and whether you were able to attend live or not, a link to the recording will be sent out. So if you have someone who wanted to be here but can't, but are registered, tell them not to worry, that link will be sent to them. So for those of you who haven't already, we highly encourage you to subscribe to our blog on our BCRC website. We share new research, time-relevant information, and updates on what the BCRC has been up to, like the announcement of the launch of our new website. If you haven't had a chance, please go check it out. We also have our latest blog post here that is highlighting some of the results from the Canadian Cow-Calf Cost of Production Network. So click right there to subscribe. We also have a ton of amazing interactive tools and calculators on our website. So these tools allow you to use your own operation numbers to guide informed decision-making and potentially identify ways to improve productivity and profitability. So there are a variety of tools that highlight topics that have an impact on your bottom line and allow producers to see numbers and estimates derived from their own records. So today I just kind of wanted to highlight one of the tools on our website, which is our tool for evaluating feed test results. And so this tool allows you to make practical sense of feed test results and determine if a single feed is sufficient to satisfy the nutrient demands of the type of cattle you are feeding. So as you see here, you select the class of cattle and then what stage of production they are in, unless you select for feeding background-eating animals, and then you'll put the average daily gain, followed by the average weight of those animals. And then you just enter the dry matter percent, TDN, crude protein, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium, exactly how they're showing up on your feed test. And it gives you almost like a traffic signal indicator of whether that feed is meeting targets. It'll be green. If it is potentially a little too high or a little too low, but probably wouldn't have any issues, you'll see the yellow. And if it is either much too high or much too red, or much too high or much too low, then it'll come up as red. So this is not a tool to balance rations, but rather to make sure that that single feed is meeting the nutrient requirements of your cattle before you put it out, and then identify these potential issues and remedy them before they happen. So we're also very excited. Our webinar tonight, as well as the 4 you see on your screen, are available for CE credits. If you have signed on as part of the CE credit program, you should be getting that certificate sent to you automatically following the live session. But if you're interested in any of our recorded webinars, feel free to check them out on the BCRC website. And again, if you do watch the recording, you will have to fill out a quiz. Rather than the live, you will be automatically sent your certificate. But if you get 70% or higher on that quiz after watching the recording, you will also automatically be awarded a continuing education credit for our RVTs and vets across Canada. If you have any other questions about these CE credits, please contact Dana Parker. We also have, in addition to all of our other resources on our website, we have a specific tab for veterinary teams, which have all of our newsletter archives. And if you're interested in our vet newsletter, we highly encourage you to subscribe to that as well. But as you can see all previous versions of that, as well as tools and resources that are specific to our RVTs and vets and vet teams across Canada. That is it for me and the BCRC. We are on social media, so feel free to give us a follow and again, subscribe to our blog. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers for this evening. We have Katie Trottier with us, as well as Melissa Atchison, who we will hear from a little bit later. But I'm going to invite Katie to share her screen while I introduce her a little bit more in depth for you guys. So originally from Northern Ontario, Katie recently completed a Master of Science in Animal Nutrition at the University of Guelph. During her master's, she focused closely on sheep and beef. Her experience includes, but is not limited to, research trials and farm visits. As a master's student, Katie managed a 2-year research project that looked at determining fiber requirements for market lambs. Katie has an in-depth knowledge and passion for Canada's ruminant livestock industry. She currently works as a ruminant livestock specialist with Perennia Food and Agriculture Inc. in Nova Scotia. So please join me in welcoming Katie.
Thanks, Sydney, and thanks everybody for joining. Let me see if I can go ahead. Okay, so as mentioned, I am from Nova Scotia, so I just wanted to give a little bit of context before I start on the types of producers that I'm dealing with. So the average herd size in Nova Scotia is around 30 or 35 cows, and it's mostly cow-calf operations that we have here. Very few cattle are actually finished in the province. Most end up going to PEI, where there's a federally inspected abattoir. There's also lots of called potatoes, so there's feedlots there. And because of our really damp climate, most producers choose to keep their cows indoors over winter. So one thing that I sometimes hear when I'm talking to producers talking about feed testing is that it doesn't really matter what the quality of the feed is because I have to feed it anyways. So why would I test it? You can't change the quality. You can't buy new feed, so you have to feed it out. And that's true, but how do you make the best of it is what I want to talk about tonight. So there are different strategies that you can use to make the best of what you have. So one workshop that I've been doing around the province recently is a stored forage quality workshop. So I'll just quickly touch on this before I go into it, because it is kind of interesting. So one of the hands-on components of the workshop that I did is I got 7 different forage samples, all of varying quality from across the province. And I've had the producers come up and they can open the bags, they can look at the forage, smell it, have a look at it. And there's some information that's provided on the species composition and the stage of cutting. And I want them to rank the forage quality from best quality down to worst quality. So comparing forage quality relative to the other forages. And while they're doing this, I've asked them to think about feeding animals in different stages of production, because that's a whole other thing altogether. So comparing forage compared to forage is not quite so difficult, but when you start to think about comparing it to what that animal needs, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So I've done this workshop 6 times now, and I've not had a single person who's able to get everything right. Most people can get the best quality identified and then the worst quality, but in the middle, it's a little bit trickier. So the point that I was wanting to make with this is that forage, it's really tricky to use visual indicators to give an idea of that quality. So unless you're feed testing, it's really, really difficult to come up with a strategy that's going to allow you to improve the efficiency of your feeding program. So there's 2 different tools that I'm going to talk about tonight for coming up with that plan once you've got your feed test. So one being a feed budget and the other one's being ration balancing. So when I'm talking about feed budgeting tonight, I'm talking about it in the sense, like, think if you had a monthly budget, you've got a set amount, and then you're going to allocate it, the amount you have into different pools. So the idea with the feed budget is to take an inventory of all the feed that you've got available at like this time of year before you start feeding out stored forages. And you come up with a plan before you start feeding it out to use it as effectively as possible over the coming months. So it's going to identify what's your best quality forage, and you're going to save that for more demanding periods like late gestation, lactation, if you've got some smaller feeders. And it's going to identify what's your lowest quality forage so that you can feed that out during less demanding periods, like if you've got cows in mid-gestation. So what this is going to do is it's going to prevent you from accidentally feeding out your better quality feeds when your animals don't need it. So if your feed strategy is you're just grabbing the first bale out of the barn, you might accidentally feed out your best quality feed when your animals don't need it. And then if you're calving in February, you only have the feed that you have. And if it doesn't happen to be as good as what you had before, you're having to supplement that, and that can be expensive. So determining what's the best use for each cut of forage is going to save you money. And feed budgeting, it's very useful for balancing rations. It's not the same thing. So balancing rations would sort of be that next step. And a feed budget in advance of that makes it more streamlined when you're coming up with those rations and you've already identified what forage you want to feed at what time and to who. So ration balancing is looking at the diet as a whole, and it's providing a diet that's going to meet an animal's nutritional requirements for their stage of production. So it's looking at the whole diet, and it's taking things into account like the dry matter content, the energy content, the protein content, the various vitamins and minerals, and how they're going to interact with each other and how they're going to be absorbed and used by the animal. So when I'm doing up rations for producers, my favorite way to do it is to start with the most appropriate forage for the group that I want to feed. So going back to that feed budget idea, I've identified what's the best use for that forage. And again, you have to test your forage to know what you have. You really can't balance a ration any other way. You can come up with a rough feed budget based on your knowledge of what you've grown, but for actually ration balancing, you do absolutely need to test. Forages are so variable even from year to year. It's dependent on things like weather, stage of cutting. Yeah, very important. So there's two things that we need to know before we can balance a ration. So the first one being, what is that forage quality? And we need to know what our animal's nutritional requirements are. So that's going to depend on the class of animal, and it's going to depend on their external environment. So for example, if cattle are being wintered outdoors or if they're in a barn, that's going to have an effect on how they're going to use that feed and what they need. So another thing, so this is not news to anybody. It's going to go without saying that cost, it has to be a dominant factor when we're feeding cows. So forages, they are going to be the basis of a profitable ruminant-based operation. So this is true if we're feeding beef cattle, if we're feeding dairy cows, if we're feeding sheep, if we're feeding goats. So optimizing our forages, it's going to be a key management goal. So the best that we can do when we're making forages, when we're storing it, and when we're feeding it out, is going to have a big impact on our bottom line. So grain and other purchase feeds that we're adding into that ration, so that should exist to supplement shortcomings that are in the forage. So we're using the forage as a base, and then we're filling in the gaps. And so this is going to depend, of course, on what inputs that you have access to. And if you've got some opportunity feeds, then that's different. But as a general rule, that's true for feeding ruminants. So the fewer shortcomings that we have in our forage, then the less that you have to supplement that with. So when you're coming up with rations, you have to break your animals up into groups because they all have different requirements. So you'll want to break your groups up into your cows and then your heifers, your feeders, and even within those groups are going to be influenced by things like the calving season, the body condition that they're in, the stage of production that they're in, and then the time of year that it is and their environment. So the time of year that you decide to calve, this is going to influence the nutrition decisions that you make throughout the year. And it might be the other way around too. You might decide when you're going to calve based on your nutrition decisions. So for example, if you decide you're going to calve out in the spring and summer, at that time of year, there's usually so much good grass, you don't know what to do with it. And so that's the time when your animals are at the highest peak of their nutritional demand, and you're matching that up really well with really good quality forage. If you're calving in the fall, that means that you're going to have good forage available throughout the winter to supply their lactation demand. And then if you're calving in the winter, that means that you're going to have good forage to be fed out during their late gestation period and their early lactation, especially if you're hoping for the optimal rebreeding interval. So now I'm going to do a pretty high level overview of nutrition across different production stages for the cow herd. And I just want to mention where this information is coming from. So this is sort of the Bible when it comes to feeding animals, is the National Research Council. Every couple of years, they will review the current scientific literature on feeding beef cattle for this instance. And so they put together some very in-depth charts outlining the different groups of animals and then the individual nutritional requirements that they need. So the ration balancing software that most of them is based on this. So just background on where that comes from. This chart I really like. It just goes through the annual production cycle of a beef cow and it just what she's going through and how that's going to influence the nutrition that she needs. So the first one that I'm going to look at is her early lactation stage. So this is the largest nutritional demand in her entire production cycle, which peaks 2 months after calving. So sometimes I hear people say like, oh, I've got beef cattle, I don't need that good of nutrition, which is true when you compare them to other species. But if you think about what we're asking of her during her early lactation, so she's got to maintain her own self, she's nursing her own calf, she's recovering from having calved, so her uterus and her reproductive tract is returning to its prepartum state. She's starting to cycle again and produce viable ovaries and be ready to bred again. She might also still be growing up her frame if she's a heifer. And then if she's calved in the winter, then she's maintaining her body heat in that cold weather. So she's burning feed for fuel. So that's quite a big demand that we're asking of her. So if we want her to do that, all that work, we have to be feeding her appropriately. So I'm sure most people have probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Cows also have a hierarchy of needs. And so what hers looks like is she's first going to use that dietary energy that she's got to maintain herself. So she's looking out for number one, and this is going to include growth if she's still growing up her frame. If there's still energy available after that, she's using that for her lactation and producing milk to grow her calf. And then if there's energy available after that, then she's using that for reproduction and is able to be bred. And then beyond that, she's laying that down as body fat and storing that. So it's really important that if we're wanting to breed her in the appropriate window, that she has enough energy to do that. And it is fine for her to milk off her back and use some stored energy in the form of body fat to make sure that all of this happens, but it has to be there in the first place for her to tap into that resource. So that's the first thing that's going to go is her ability to rebreed. And then just a note on rebreeding. So having enough energy in the diet, it's really, really important for reproductive success. So the different processes that are involved with reproduction are energy dependent. So producing the hormones that's going to control reproduction depends on having enough energy. And same with, so before that embryo was really implanted and maintained, there's communication that happens between the cow and that embryo to make sure that it's going to be viable. And that is energy dependent as well. So really, really important that she's being fed appropriately. So in this period, she needs good quality feeds. So general rule of thumb, this is going to depend on other factors, but we can say that she needs 11% crude protein and 65% energy. So when you're looking at your feed test, the energy is going to be reported as TDN most likely. So that's total digestible nutrients. So when you're coming up with your feed budget, so this is her most demanding period. So save your best quality feeds for this time. Also really important, vitamins and minerals are balanced, and lots of clean water. So clean water is always really important, but it's of particular importance at this stage. Going into late lactation when she's in her early gestation. So it's still a demanding production phase, but it's decreasing as that calf it's not relying exclusively on milk anymore. She is hopefully bred at this point, but the requirements from that gestation, they're still really, really minimal. But I still tend to use the rule of thumb for 11% crude protein and 65% energy. During her mid-gestation, so that calf is weaned and she's in her dry period. So this is the point in her cycle when she's got the lowest nutritional requirements. The gestation requirements at this point are still fairly low. So the rule of thumb that we can use is 7% crude protein and 55% energy. It is still important that we're feeding her properly because there can be an impact on how well her calf is going to grow if she's being a bit neglected during the stage. So it's lower, but we still need to make sure that she's being fed appropriately. And then during her late gestation period, so this is another really important period. So it's almost 2/3 of that fetal growth is going to happen in the last 2 months of her pregnancy. And this is a really demanding period. So it requires a significant amount of nutrients, energy specifically. At the same time, she's starting to develop milk and colostrum as she's nearing the end of the gestation period. So she's got her own maintenance requirements, the fetal requirements, and then the lactation requirements. So another thing that's happening that as that calf is growing, and it's growing at quite a fast rate, almost a pound a day. So as it's growing and it's taking up room in her body cavity, one thing that can happen is that it's starting to compress her rumen a little bit. So it can't expand as much as it normally would. So it sometimes can affect her dry matter intake because her rumen just can't expand and she can't physically eat as much as she was able to, especially if she's eating something that's really wet, because a lot of that is just water and it doesn't provide nutritional value. So there's 2 ways that you can sort of get around this if you're finding she's not able to maintain her intake. You can offer a feed that's drier because there's less water that's just taking up space, or you can offer something that's a bit more nutrient dense, like grain, for example. Cows, they can tap into their energy reserves, but this can lead to complications when she's giving birth. So it's better for her to maintain those reserves to be used during her lactation period. And the rule of thumb that we use for this period is 9% crude protein and 60% energy. So I've sort of glossed over these already. So 7, 9, 11 is the rule of thumb when we're feeding the mature cows. If we're feeding feeder calves, 14, 12, 10 is this quick rule of thumb that we use. So up to 800 pounds, feeder calves need 14% crude protein. 800 to 1,050 pounds need 12%. And then up until finish weight, they need 10% crude protein. So when they're smaller, they're still growing their frames up. So they require more protein and less energy. It's not good for them to have an oversupply of energy in this period. They'll start to put down fat and it doesn't end up benefiting them. It's pretty expensive, but then once they've grown their frames up and they start to hang something off that frame is when they need more energy intensive diets. So these rules of thumb, they're a rough guide to help you remember ballparks of what they need. It is not a hard and fast rule because there's different things you have to consider that I've gone through before, even things like palatability issues, just many external factors to think about. Dry matter intake, another kind of ballpark figure. So we're going to expect our animals to eat 2 to 3% of their body weight in dry matter. So once that water has been taken out, so a cow that's 1,200 pounds, we can expect her to eat 24 pounds of dry matter per day. Also, cows, they will consume more good quality forage than poor quality forage, as it'll be more digestible and there'll be less time spent for it to break down and pass through our system. So Sydney's gone over this before. I wanted to include it because I think it's such a useful and practical tool for producers to use. But I'm no longer going to have to show you how it works. But it's, yeah, very easy to use. Would recommend it. Really useful if you're coming up with a feed budget. And then this is the ration balancing software that I use. It's called Cow Bites. And I think it's the University of Alberta that does it. There are a couple of other ration balancing softwares that exist. This is what I'm familiar with. So it's a similar idea of inputting your animals' details. So under this tab here, there's animal type. So you input their details, and then at the bottom, there's a place for you to input the environmental details, which I do recommend doing because it will make a significant difference. And then along the top, there is a preloaded feed library with several different options of feed. So as I mentioned before, when I'm doing a ration for somebody, I like to start with the forage that makes the most sense for them. So I'll go in and I'll find something that most closely resembles it. So I'll go ahead and I'll click add. Then I'll go over to edit, and there's an option for you to change the value so it reflects the forage that you're feeding. And then you can play around with it and see where the gaps exist, and then go and add anything else that you're interested in feeding. And then when you go over to ration, it's going to give you the different options that you selected. And then it's going to give you along the bottom of the page here, those individual nutrients. And so it's the same idea of the stoplight, with green being go, and then it'll flag you yellow if it's sort of borderline, and then red if it's inappropriate. So then you can see where it says dry matter intake here. It's going to give you what that animal is expected to eat. And then based on that, I go into the dry matter, and I'm not sure if I have an option to share my cursor, but I'll play with the different amounts here. And then as you enter them, you can see how the individual nutrients are affected by the different amounts. So you can adjust accordingly. And you can toggle along the bottom here. There's several more options, which I would show if I didn't just have a screen grab here. And then once you have balanced it to the best of your ability, then you can go over and get a report done. So that's what I've got. So now I'll pass it over to Melissa.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was so great. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So this is Melissa Atchison. Melissa grew up on a purebred Charolais operation in the Interlake region of Manitoba. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of Manitoba, focusing on animal science. She has worked as a primary products inspector with the CFIA. Following that, she served 8 years with Manitoba Agriculture as a livestock specialist. Melissa is currently the Manitoba Provincial Coordinator with the VBP Plus program and is currently a research and extension specialist at Manitoba Beef Producers. Along with her husband, Trevor, and his family, they run Poplarview Stock Farm. Trevor and Melissa have approximately 700 head of mother cows and have a small backgrounding lot. They have 2 children, Reese and Wyatt, who are the 5th generation on the farm. In her spare time, Melissa enjoys training and showing reined cow horses, cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, and hiking. So please join me in welcoming Melissa.
Thank you, Sydney, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. Just some background on the operation at Poplarview Stock Farm. I married into this farm. This is my husband and his family. This is who makes the world go round around here. Everybody has their part to play in keeping this machine going. I like to think I'm just a gopher. So established in 1900, as Sydney said, we're raising the 5th generation on the farm with our son and daughter. We run approximately 700 mother cows. And with that, we have about 600 acres of crop, 2,700 acres of hay, wild and tame, 5,000 acres of wild and tame pasture, as well as the backgrounding lot. So I come at this with a bit different perspective than Katie, as you know, we're just a bit more extensive here, more of a typical Western operation. Next slide, please. Thanks. So on our operation, grass management and low-cost winter feeding strategies are paramount to profitability. It's been hard to reach profitability in the last few years. Our calving, the cows begin calving on May 1st on grass. Cows and yearlings are rotationally grazed all summer on native grass, tame pasture. We'll grow some polycrop. They will graze silage regrowth. And then we do some stockpile grazing and different extended grazing practices into the fall and winter to try to shorten up that actual winter feeding period. So here we have some photos of our, our grazing management in summer, and then here in winter, where we're doing our swath grazing. The calves are weaned in November-ish, and they go into the backgrounding lot, and their ration is stepped up every 45 days. We take weights and step up the ration accordingly. We also just monitor the disappearance from the bunks to see if they're eating what they're supposed to be eating and what their intake is like. I'm so sorry, there's a cat in here. Next slide, please. Just some photos from our operation to give you some context of what day-to-day life is like around here. That bottom right-hand corner, I don't know what you all did for phys ed class in remote learning, but we shoveled bunks, and the kids couldn't wait to get back to school and away from the phys ed program that we had here on the farm. Next slide. So feed test. We are big proponents of feed testing here on the farm. We test every single feed ingredient that we grow. So I keep zip top bags in business. Pro tip, Dollarama has them very cheap if you're doing lots of feed testing. I'd like to, like Katie said earlier, forage isn't forage. It's so variable year to year. Even the same ingredient off the same field, the same species off the same field can be different based on different environmental factors. So you can't tell by looks alone. And I like to think that feed testing is pretty cheap insurance, because you don't know, if you don't know what you have, you don't know how to feed it, right? And like Katie said, you don't want to be feeding your most powerful bang for your buck nutrient dense feed at the wrong time of the year, and then all of a sudden there's a cold snap and that's all gone. So you want to know what's in your feed ingredients to be able to targeted feed, right? Here we have just a local lab, that a typical one that people would use in Manitoba often. Some of the NIR packages, $38, $42. It's not very expensive at all to get a feed test done, depending on what you want to find in that feed test. Next slide, please. Here's some examples of our feed tests, just some quick ones. There's some SO1 oats here from 2021, and then some of our fine prairie hay. I'm going to get into the thick of it here. So, fine prairie hay, 6.1% protein on a dry matter basis, but over here, we're going to see our copper amounts in our different feeds. And I mean, Western Canada is pretty known to be low in copper in their soils and in their forages. And so I'm going to give you a bit of a case study when we get into the thick of it here from our farm, of why feed testing and then targeted nutrition is so important, and then balancing rations. So why are we sticklers for feed testing and ration balancing? Next slide. As far as the feeder cattle go, that's pretty cut and dried, right? You put them in the lot, you mix the ration, you put it in front of their faces, and they eat it. You know that they're getting what they're supposed to get They don't have any other option. You give them the bunk space, you have a targeted gain, right? So we target about 1.75 pounds to 2 pounds per day of gain to reach our target weights for different marketing periods. But they are pretty cut and dry. What is way more challenging on our operation is the cow herd. Next slide, please, Katie. So we try to be low input operators, you know, bale grazing, swath grazing, silage pile grazing, extended the grazing season on, you know, these more poor quality feed. We try to be low input operators in the way that our cows don't have as high requirements during those cold months, so we can feed them more poor quality feed, just by virtue of calving in May and June. But cows eat what they want and not what they need. So it is hard to balance a ration when you're feeding extensively like this. On our bale grazing, we try to give 2 days. Well, we do give 2 days of feed at a time. And we know how many pounds are out there of the bales. We know how the dry matter intake should be and all these things. So we know that their balanced ration is out there, but we also have to make sure that everybody's getting the right bites. Next slide. Here's an example of our silage pile grazing. So we pile the pit in the field, we have an electric wire around it. I'm so sorry, this cat is being a hammerhead. And so we just run a aircraft cable across it like a bunk. The pile is packed a little bit lower and everybody feeds at this bunk and gets their silage that way. And this is one of our feeding groups. And we move that wire daily. So being low input is all fine and good, but we know that you cannot starve a profit into a cow. That's not how low input feeding works, low input operating works. You cannot starve a profit into a cow. You're going to hurt your bottom line. And we'll get into that here. Next slide. So fertility is key, right? That is our #1 factor determining profitability. And our winter feeding period is our biggest cost over the year. You can't starve a profit into a cow, right? So fertility is a direct function of nutrition. So what we do, we preg check, and at preg check time, that's when we sort into our targeted feeding groups. So that's when we do our body condition scoring. There I am preg checking. And so we'll assess that cow at that point and say, you know, she's a fat, mature cow. She goes with that group. First and second calvers, without question, go into their own feeding group, and they get a better quality and or quantity of groceries. And we also will put the poor doers with those animals as well. Not that they're thin inherent, like some of those cows are just thin inherently, no matter what we feed them. They're just those tough looking cows. They raise a big calf every year. That's just how they are. So we always just want to make sure, because they're inherently like that, we make sure that we put them with the first and second calvers, getting a little bit better quality and quantity of feed. Then we have our cull cows. Obviously, we may or may not feed them up depending on the price and the cost of gain. And then our feeder cattle are separated by sex and weight. Next slide, please. So even when doing the right things right, we were having a really bad wreck with high open rates. And when I say high open rates, we went from a gradual change from about a typical 10% average open rate to suddenly 15 to 18%. And I mean, it was suddenly, but it was gradual over a period of, 3 years. We were doing the air quote right things right. We were semen testing bulls. We were feed testing all of our feed ingredients. We were ration balancing. We were rotational grazing, managing our grass. We have a robust herd health and vaccine program. We were feeding a breeder mineral. And we were separating into our targeted feeding groups. And these open cattle had no rhyme or reason. There was no pattern. They were fat, they were thin, they were young cows, they were old cows, they were cows that calved on the first cycle. It didn't matter if they were AI or natural service. We select our heifers for fertility we purposely select them out of older cows. We make sure that they're 65% of their mature body weight at breeding time. So we just didn't know what was going on. 65% of our cows were calving on the first cycle. We had good calf figure, low mortality, low morbidity. Even our feeder cattle were doing great in the feedlot. We did know, though, although we were feeding mineral-free choice, we were struggling with consumption. We knew how much they were supposed to be getting, and we do have certain pastures in summer where we cannot get cows to eat our mineral. I suspect it has to do with being near a marsh, and there's lots of salt in some of that marsh grass, and it really limits their intake. So whether or not we added salt or removed salt from the free choice mineral, we could not get them to eat mineral in those pastures at that time. However, in winter, our mineral consumption would go up and would increase. So we figured we were awash on their mineral stores, but we weren't sure why we were having these fertility issues. We were very, very frustrated. Next slide. So because we could not get answers, we had no rhyme or reason, we were doing all the right things right, we decided to do liver biopsies on the cows. So we had this team come out to do liver biopsies, very quick and easy. If you've never done a liver biopsy, they can do it while standing. We have an oral distraction tool called an Easy Boss. We put in their mouth, they chew on it. A little bit of lidocaine goes in, and then they puncture a hole, and they quickly take the sample. The cow stands quietly. It's very straightforward, not painful. The cow walks out, no harm, no foul. Next slide, please. So our liver biopsy results were a gut punch. Normal copper of a wet sample from a liver of a cow is 20 to 100 parts per million, and deficient is considered below 20 parts per million. Our herd average was 9.3. We had cows as low as 2.2. Like, it was terrible. Zinc, normal 25 to 100. Deficient is considered below 20. All of our animals tested were deficient to marginal. Selenium, normal 0.25 to 0.5. Deficient below 0.22. All animals tested were deficient to marginal. And like I said, we are feeding free choice mineral. We, again, because of our extensive operation and our forage-based rations, feeding grain to force feed this was not an option. Next slide. Yeah, so here's just pointing out our low copper in our forage samples. 7, 5, 3, 3, not good. Next slide. So what did we do? So we opted to switch minerals to a custom mineral blend that was so high in zinc and copper and selenium that it did require a veterinary prescription. But the difference was this is very, very highly bioavailable, chelated amounts of those trace minerals. And it was also highly palatable to encourage intake. So what was the results of changing this mineral program? We went from 18% open to 12% open to 10% open in very short order. So even considering the 2021 drought, we still only had 10% open after having years of a fertility wreck, essentially. We've also seen a trend in higher calf weights and improved rebreed, especially on our second calvers. So that's been really, really good. Next slide. So like Katie was saying, forage is the base, you fill in the gaps. That's what we were doing with our mineral, or so we thought with our original mineral. And there was nothing inherently wrong with that original mineral package or that company. On paper, we were meeting requirements, but I think what I suspect happened was a perfect storm. We had two big flood events in pretty short order, 2011 and 2014, and the grass was very washy. And I think those cows got so behind on their stores of their copper and zinc in their liver that they just couldn't catch up in subsequent years, given our low copper status in our forages as it is. Plus, you compound that with low palatability and low intake in certain times of year, and they just couldn't build that status up to where it needed to be. So now the cost of this mineral is not, the new mineral is not cheap, right? The difference between 18% open and 10% open on 700 cows would be 56 extra calves. 56 calves, assuming half are steers and half are heifers. They're about 450 pounds for the heifers and 470 pounds of weaning weight on the steers. That gives us $66,486 of extra value in increased calf crop on the calf crop alone, right? So in the increased calf crop on a 700 cow herd. The increased cost of feeding this mineral was $45 per cow per year. So our annual cost of feeding this new mineral is $75 per cow per year. And that, you may think I'm crazy for feeding my cows $75 worth of mineral per year, when our old stuff was $30. But, you know, with it just an increase, if you're spending $45 more per cow in annual cost of this new mineral, that's netting us $34,986 of net benefit for this expensive, objectively expensive mineral. Yes, on paper it's very expensive, but if we're weaning that many extra calves, and then this, you also have to take into consideration the cost of what we used to have in heifer retention or buying back in, having that high of an open rate. So at 18% open rate, we had to have 22% heifer retention or buyback to maintain our herd size. With 10%, we only need 11% retention. So the cost of keeping those cows and cow depreciation also plays a huge factor into this. So, you know, let us be a cautionary tale. You know, we just thought, gosh, we were balancing rations and everything. Well, we'll just put out a little more feed. It doesn't matter that we were putting out more feed if they could use what was in it. So, you know, the liver biopsies, dig deeper when you maybe have a problem. Feed testing and ration balancing should correct 99% of problems that you have, but this is just a great example of, you know, how bad it can get when you don't know the status of your herd or what they need, or you're not matching up their requirements to the feed ingredients and mineral program you have. I think that was my last slide. The only thing I'm going to do is rag on Katie for using because I forgot to mention, we are a Limousin Angus cross herd, a lot of Limplex type cattle around here. And you used that homely picture of the most homely looking Limousin cow multiple times in your presentation. I just had to laugh at her. She was not winning any beauty contest, that girl.
I'm so sorry.
With that, I'll turn it back over to Katie to wrap it up.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thanks. So I guess the take-home messages to take from this is that both feed budgets and balanced rations are really useful tools to make the best with what you already have. So they can help to reduce overfeeding, which is very expensive. It can help to improve animal health and performance. It can help to reduce supplementation and helps your bottom line ultimately. I really love this point from Melissa about you can't starve profit into a cow. And if you need help with your own rations, make sure that you reach out to a qualified nutritionist to help you out. I think most provinces would have somebody, or you've got somebody local to help you out. And that's, yeah, what we've got tonight.
Thank you, Melissa, for your great presentation. And again, thank you, Katie. we are going to open it up to our live Q&A session now. And I encourage everybody, if you are sitting on a question or haven't submitted your question yet, please do so now, and then we will definitely get to it. So our first question, I believe this is going to be, it's for both of you guys. What is the value of doing a liver biopsy? Could blood sampling not detect this problem?
Yeah, I can go first if you want, Katie. So from what I understand is that serum copper levels are a good snapshot of that moment in time, but they don't actually give a good reflection of the actual status and the storage levels of the cow over time, if that makes sense. Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
Just to add that animals will store certain minerals in their liver. So copper is a good example. So they'll store excess copper in the liver. So even what's circulating in the blood might not show up how much is actually there. So it's just more accurate to take the liver samples.
So they could show as they could be deficient even with having adequate serum copper levels showing, correct?
I'm not,
because their liver stores are low.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Thank you both. We have another question. Would a deficiency in one mineral also impact availability of another mineral to the animal?
Certain ones are complementary, right? Like copper and zinc are complementary, but there's probably more worry about tying up, like molybdenum tying up copper, sulfur tying up copper, that type of thing, and affecting absorption. Do you have anything to add, Katie?
No, not really. Just, yeah, there are several interactions, but it's more so an imbalance. Like if you've got, you might have each thing in an appropriate level, but they also have to be fed in certain ratios. So if there's an oversupply of one thing, it can mean that the animal can't absorb another. I can't think of examples off the top of my head how a deficiency in one would impact another, although it could, because then it would throw those rations out of balance. So yeah, it could.
Thank you both. We have another question here. When you're targeted feeding, there is value in separating certain groups of cattle and feeding them like separately to like individualize those diets. So could you guys maybe go into a little bit about which classes of cattle are best to be fed together and some of those, the most like basic way to kind of separate out and have individualized feeding without kind of having 7 different diets for your herd?
I would say do what's practical for you. Like it has to be practical. If you can break them up into multiple groups, then great. I think I'll let Melissa talk about how they break up their herd. But certainly feed your cows a certain way compared to, and then the mature cows versus ones that are still growing their frame up, they need a bit better nutrition. But yeah, do the best you can with what's practical.
Yeah, I totally agree. It has to work for your operation. So what we do is healthy, mature cows, if they are in at the adequate body condition score, they're in one contemporary group. First and second calvers are automatically, without a doubt, in a contemporary group. And then we may add, because again, we don't want to have 10 different feeding groups. It's impractical. So into that first and second calver group, because they are getting better quality and quantity of feed, we will often that's where we'll stack cows that are hard doers. Maybe, you know, someone who, yeah, just came in thin. Maybe she's an older cow, like she's still catching on the first cycle. There's nothing wrong with her. She still has teeth, but maybe she doesn't need to be battling it out in the healthy, mature cow herd. So we're going to give her a little bit better opportunity to get some better quality groceries. And then of course we have our bulls. So yearling bulls, again, because they are still growing, they get their own feeding group, but mature bulls, they go out and rough it. There is no classification on the farm that has lower requirements than mature bulls. I wish they were like air mattresses and we could just fold them up for 300 days of the year.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. We have another question. Could soil sampling help detect imbalances in minerals for your feed?
Yes and no. It has a lot to do with
How that animal is able to absorb it. So there's two different types of mineral deficiency. So I think like a primary nutrient deficiency is because the soil is deficient in that. So selenium would be a good example. So if you know that your selenium is deficient in it, then the plants aren't going to uptake it. And then your animals aren't going to get selenium. So I think it's quite widespread across Canada, that issue. So soil sampling would pick that up. And actually in Nova Scotia, like our soils are so deficient in selenium that the lab won't even test for selenium because it's just assumed there's effectively none. I would caution you from making rations based on soil samples just because there's so many interactions that happen within the ration. So it might look fine on paper, but that might not be how it actually gets fed out, especially because there are so many factors that go into how it's absorbed and utilized by the body. Melissa, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Katie, I will ask one final question and then we'll let everybody go here. But Melissa, I really enjoyed the cowboy math and I kind of wanted to ask about how you keep your records in terms of like the feed you have, the feed testing and the cost and stuff like that in order to help you make future decisions in future years.
Yeah, well, we keep record, we put up all our own feeds. So in terms of the cost to us, we keep track of opportunity costs and, you know, all of that in the ration. But sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Just like what kinds of records you keep and how you keep them in order to do this math and be able to help that you make decisions later on.
Yeah, we, you know, my husband keeps piles of spreadsheets. He loves spreadsheets. Well, he hates spreadsheets, but he loves spreadsheets for the information that they give you. But yeah, like we know approximate cost. I mean, the last time we penciled it out, the cost to keep a cow here is about $1,000 a year. So it's getting tight. It's tight when you're feeding $70 worth of mineral. But again, you have to think of, you know, what value that's bringing in, the ROI on it, right? So yeah, no, we do keep a lot of records here in terms of with our calving and cow records. We have a software program, and then in terms of our own feed that we put up, that is all on spreadsheets. Yeah.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, I just wanted to thank both of our speakers once again. You guys did such an excellent job and we're very grateful to have you here tonight, especially Katie. It is, I believe it's 11 p.m. out in the Maritimes right now, so thank you so much. But yeah, with that, thank you everyone for joining us and we'll see you all hopefully for our next webinar on November 23rd. So thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.